My guest tonight is Brandon Martinez. Brandon is an independent writer and journalist from Canada who specializes in foreign policy issues, international affairs, and 20th and 21st century history. For years, he has written on Zionism, Israel-Palestine, American and Canadian foreign policy, war, terrorism, and deception in media and politics. He is the co-founder of Non-Aligned Media and is the author of Grand Deceptions and Hidden History. Brandon's blog is martinezperspective.com. Brandon, how you doing tonight?
Doing well.
Sorry, that's your blog.
Yeah. Martinez Perspective is the repository for all my articles, and then there's nonalignedmedia.com, which is my main blogging venue.
Okay, it is Martinez Perspective. I just had a misprint here.
That's fine.
I started saying it right. Okay, great. MartinezPerspective.com. Listen, you've done a number of I've been following your material on Non-Aligned Media and reading your stuff, and you've covered a number of provocative, very interesting issues. One is the issue of Putin and his perception in the West, particularly among the alternative media and maybe critics of Anglo-American foreign policy, and the tendency among those critical of Anglo-American foreign policy or the Atlanticist bloc or NATO to idealize Putin too much and maybe not
Right.
see him as some sort of virtuous standard bearer of all that is pure and right in the world.
Right.
And
Yeah.
you've called a number of these people out or criticized their views. And Putin, now obviously this is because what Putin appears to be opposing, which is the Atlanticist bloc, and sort of the
Right.
this lunge forward by NATO since the end of the Cold War, and its reaction to NATO's aggression. But you've also made the point of that Putin also has a lot of skeletons in his closet coming from his background. Do you want to get into that?
Sure.
What does Putin represent, and to the West? Is he real opposition, or is it something that we should be? I think someone we should be more skeptical of.
Well, I'm definitely of the view that we should be skeptical of Putin. Like you said, there's a growing trend within the anti-NATO crowd, the people who are critical of Western foreign policy, which I include myself in that. However, what we've seen develop over the past, especially over the past 2 years, I would say, is this unreserved fawning at the feet of Russia, is this worship, this hero savior mentality that's been enveloping much of the alternative media to the point where it's almost cult-like. If you come out in any way criticize Putin for some of his past wrongs or even some of his activities today, you are considered an outcast. You are considered a heretic who should be shunned. And a lot of these people, some of them that I've known from past endeavors, have attacked me because of my stances on Putin, because I refuse to bow to this Putin, the white hat savior narrative, which on its face is ludicrous, just by virtue of the fact that the man sprung right out of the Soviet KGB system. So for anyone who's read about that history and has followed that whole era, the epoch in Russian history, you know that you cannot make it in the KGB system without being ruthless, without being opportunistic, conniving. How do you make it up the ranks through one of the most feared and murderous state security agencies in the history of the world, make it to the very top of that without being a very, very nefarious kind of character who's willing to step on anybody to get to the top? So that's one point that just blows out of the water the idea that Putin himself is coming at this from a moral perspective. This is what I rebuke in these people. My argument is not that Putin is the worst guy in the world, is the worst politician in the world. Obviously not. But at the same time, the idea that he's a moral man, that he's motivated by ethics and moral principles is patently absurd. And when you look at some of his early machinations in Russia, the way he came to power as Yeltsin's hand-picked successor, people rightly criticize Yeltsin for being a corrupt drunkard that he was, who handed off the whole country to these 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 oligarchs. and he handpicked Putin, and all of those people actually supported Putin initially, and it was a very, very dirty game that was being played there. To make a long story short, what they did is they grabbed Putin. They realized Yeltsin's time was up. He had no popularity in Russia. They wanted to put somebody else in there, so they picked Putin, who was the head of the FSB at the time, to succeed him. But the only way that they could do that was to draw the Russian public's attention away from all the rampant corruption involved with Yeltsin and the oligarchs in the Kremlin and all of the looting that went on. So what they did was they orchestrated these terrorist attacks known as apartment bombings, which were used as an impetus to, one, start a war with Chechnya, the second war in a decade, which was a bloody and brutal war. And what it was designed to do ultimately was to take the public's attention away from the corruption in the Kremlin, put it on this war, put it on this external enemy. You know, they created this external enemy image in a very similar way that the United States does with Al-Qaeda and these Islamic boogeymen that they've propped up and that are covertly working with themselves. And Russia did the exact same strategy, right? The false flag tactic of putting the attention on a scary external enemy to take attention away from corruption. And this led to Putin's rise to power. He seized upon that as his casus belli to elevate himself to power. He started talking tough, like he's this tough leader who's going to crack down on terrorism and so forth. And then we look into it in the apartment bombings. There's a plethora of evidence and work out there showing that those were false flag operations conducted by the FSB, which Putin was the head of just before those happened. They caught Russian FSB agents planning a bomb in a building, and about 2 days after that, they started bombing Chechnya. They instantly pointed the finger at the Chechens, like you'd expect with a false flag, the instant assignment of blame to the enemy without an investigation. And when some principled Russian lawmakers started to probe into that terrorist bombing, they started to drop like flies. They started dying. Many Russian politicians in opposition parties who began investigating those apartment bombings and all of the aspects surrounding the Chechen war started to get killed, literally hitman style, gunned down in the streets, which I cover in one of my articles on Putin. And in that, they used those bombings to divert the attention and start the war, which Putin, of course, rode that wave of righteous indignation to power. So we're seeing very much the exact same strategies and tactics that the West has used in its wars of aggression being employed by Putin, and then we take that further into the 21st century with the war on terror, and we learn that Putin was one of the first guys to call Bush after 9/11, pledge his support to the war on terror, and offer Russian assistance in the war in Afghanistan. I document that thoroughly. So people, when they talk about Putin, they start the clock at the year around 2008 or so, when he started to butt heads with the West, right, over the Georgia situation and a few other areas. Putin starts to butt heads with the West. But you look deep into his history, we find that originally, he was trying to secure his seat at the globalist table through teaming up with America in this phony, bogus war on terror. There's a lot of similarities between Russia and the U.S. policy and Israeli policy. In fact, the Israelis were ecstatic about Putin's policies towards Chechnya because it's similar to what they're doing in Gaza, and they make almost identical arguments and talking points to justify their violence against those people. So Putin was neck deep in corruption and evil in his early days, and that's some of the things I'm talking about when I'm trying to make the point that Putin's not a moral man. But even in today's context, yeah, it seems like he's more and more pushing against NATO and its interventionist policies, somewhat to some extent, but even then, it's not very consistent. You'll notice because he kind of signed off on that NATO intervention in Libya, didn't really do anything to stop that. I quoted some of his statements from early in the 2000s where he was saying things like he doesn't need evidence that Osama bin Laden was involved in 9/11. He will just take for granted that the American story is true. I mean, he said that. He said he doesn't even require evidence. And then in 2011, someone asked him about 9/11 and said, do you think it was an inside job, a false flag? And he rebuked that strongly and said, no, no way. False flags, intelligence agencies don't do things like that. And I kind of tied that into his history of false flag terrorism. I mean, it makes more sense that he takes that position on 9/11 when you look at his involvement in such activities himself and his early collaboration with the U.S. and going along with that agenda and that narrative. So it makes more sense when you bring those things into context. But even in today's world, we see he's intervened in Syria to some extent. But I don't really view that as evidence that he is committed to taking down the West. I mean, some of these grandiose theories, I think that they just do not fit reality. They're fanciful thinking, because this idea that Putin, he doesn't even have the power to take down the West, let alone the interest in doing so. He wants to work with the West when he can, which is why he's always saying in his interviews, our American partners, our Western counterparts, our partners, blah, blah, blah. So he wants to work with them. He has disagreements with them. Russia and China have some disagreements with them on some foreign policy issues, but there are other issues where they're in complete lockstep with one another. For example, the Second World War issue, the West and the East, the victorious powers of World War II, they have come together in stamping out any sort of revisionism about the Second World War because they're the victors. They want to uphold their fabled version of events, so they have to stop any skeptics and critics of that. And we've seen Putin put in place a Holocaust denial law and a similar edict saying you can't criticize Stalin and the Red Army for their activities in World War II. China has similar laws. Of course, these powers were allied with the U.S. and Britain and France and the Allied powers in the Second World War. So there's many points of agreement. There's some points of disagreement. But one thing I wanted to mention with the NATO and a lot of these critics of Western foreign policy are always talking about NATO's expansion and so forth, which is true to some extent. However, if you look at the context of the whole Cold War situation, yes, NATO is expanding, but the Soviet Union, let's not forget, the Soviet Union expanded deep into Europe. It conquered half of Europe after World War II. Stalin waltzed in, which was his ultimate plan, was to let Germany and Britain and France fight each other to the death, and then Stalin planned to swoop in and enslave these countries to Bolshevism, which is what he did. He took over half of Europe and East Germany. Most of Central Asia came under Soviet rule. Communism was exported to China, to Vietnam, to North Korea, to all these other areas. The Soviet Union had the Comintern, right, which was a body that was promoting international Marxism all over the world, sponsoring red mercenaries to create insurrections in various countries to establish Marxist governments that would be allied with the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union absolutely was an imperialistic power, pushing not only its ideology but its military power over its surrounding regions. So it was the biggest country in the world, right? The Soviet Union was the largest landmass on Earth, not because they're goody two-shoes, but because they were a brutal empire. So I find a lot of the discourse around the Soviet Union, this romanticization of the Soviet Union by a lot of these kind of leftist anti-imperialists, they're just ignoring huge swaths of history of Soviet atrocities as well. We can condemn NATO atrocities and Western atrocities, but that doesn't mean that the Soviet Union is somehow the white hat good guy. Just because they didn't intervene, let's say, as much as NATO did. Like the United States invaded Vietnam and bombed Laos and Cambodia and did these kind of far off wars in these far off lands. The Soviet Union didn't do as many of those. However, they didn't need to because they had already conquered half of Europe, Central Asia, and much of its surrounding regions. It didn't need to just branch out that far. It was just it took the approach more of funding covert revolutionaries, which the U.S. did as well in Latin America and so forth. But we're seeing this kind of polarizing narrative developing of good versus evil. It's like the West is evil and the East must be good, right? Take your pick, one or the other. It's either you're with the Atlanticist NATO power or you're with the BRICS Eastern New World Order, right? There's two kind of competing factions, but they're both, in my opinion, they're both bad, they're both evil, they both don't present real alternatives. That's why I call my website non-aligned media, right? Because I took my principles sort of stemming from the non-aligned movement. I don't want to be aligned to any big power. I don't want to bend to the will of Russia or China or the United States or Zionism or any of these power blocks. They're all corrupt. They're all evil in their own ways, some worse than others. So that's some of the things I was talking about.
Now, with Putin, regarding Putin, you get a sense, when he's disregarding or saying that theories regarding 9/11 an inside job, and saying that you shouldn't even consider that because it's just outrageous. Intelligence agencies don't do such things. I think at a certain level, intelligence agencies are all kind of they hang out together, and so there's an understanding
Right.
at that level that these things are done, and it just isn't talked about in public.
Right. I think they have like a gentleman's agreement
Yeah, and
where they don't unearth each other's dark secrets.
CIA knows what the dirty things the Mossad does, and Mossad knows what the dirty things the CIA does, and FSB or Soviet intelligence. They all kind of knew what they were doing, and it's in its own way. It was their own little game they were playing, and everything else was kind of like collateral damage at that level.
They all have dirt on each other,
Yeah.
and they all have blackmail material on each other. So if Putin came out and started criticizing the U.S. government's narratives on the war on terror and various false flag attacks, then they would just whip out this apartment bombing stuff and start exposing him. So he can't really afford to do it because his whole career is built on a pile of bones and blood himself. So on that level, he's compromised. On that level, how can he not be controlled by the powers that be? They could expose him at any time and overthrow him, but he's managed to hold on to power for 16 years, and that's also suspicious. If he was really some grand opponent of everything that we see the West and the globalists doing, or these roundtable groups, then why is Henry Kissinger friends with Putin, right? Why is Berlusconi, that corrupt politician from Italy, why is he best buddies with Putin? Why is Nicolas Sarkozy, corrupt scumbag from France, NATO stooge, Zionist fanatic, why is he Putin's mouthpiece in Europe? Literally, he is the advocate for Putin in Europe, who's saying that we need to work with Russia. So I think we see somewhat of a split in the elite, where there's some who don't like some aspects of Putin, but there's some who say that he can work with us. We can work with him. He should have a seat at the table. So I think there's probably a bit of a split within the elite of the West about Putin, because he's not completely 100% on board with everything that they want, right? But he is on board with many things that they want, and he's of course in lockstep with all the phony narratives about terrorism, about World War II. He supports all those narratives. So I think to look to him as a grand revolutionary who's going to struggle and crusade against the New World Order, this is a fantasy. This cannot be proven to be true.
And one way to look at it is maybe look at it maybe the five families of New York, how you have maybe competing factions in a criminal game, in a criminal enterprise, and there might be real divisions and real disagreements among these elites, but nevertheless the story that's retailed to the public is false.
Right.
Yeah. So.
Right, and same goes for Russia itself. There's different factions, and just like in any country, there's factions of the elite who have fights, who have disputes and feuds, just like you saw with Stalin and Trotsky, right? You had that whole Stalin-Trotsky feud. All the Trotskyites and people loyal to Leon Trotsky were chased out of the Soviet Union by Stalin. They're both communists, but they had disagreements, maybe some ideological disagreements, but mostly just power disagreement. Stalin wanted to control the country, and Trotsky wanted to control the country, and Stalin won out. Doesn't mean Trotsky's good, does it? No, Trotsky was a mass murderer himself. So this is the kind of thinking we see now developing. And it's myopic, very one-sided thinking that if somebody is being like maligned in the media or something, that must mean they're good. That doesn't work either, because if we're going to take that argument that because the Western mainstream media is bad-mouthing Putin on some things, that means he must be on our side. He must be good. Well, the Western mainstream media is also bashing ISIS 24/7, aren't they? They're rolling out the red carpet of ISIS's atrocities 24/7. Does that mean we should embrace ISIS? You know, that it's silly. It's a silly argument. I mean, they basically the mainstream media's critiques are not my critiques of Putin, right? I don't portray the same analysis. I critique him. My yardsticks for critiquing him are much different than the mainstream media. And the mainstream media just does what the governments tell them to do. So when Putin is cooperating on different issues, you'll see that the mainstream media diminishes its criticism. At some points they completely wipe out that criticism. Like in the early days when he was cooperating with the war on terror, there was basically no criticism of Putin and some of Russia's atrocities in Chechnya. So it's just a game that's being played. We see different little factions fighting each other, even within the U.S. establishment. You know, you have the neocons who are basically Zionist Israel firsters who didn't like a war, didn't see a war they didn't like in the Middle East. But then you have like Brzezinski and these other realists who don't like the neocons, who don't think we should be in the Middle East, who think we should be focused on curtailing Russia and China and so forth. So there's splits even within the Americans. It doesn't mean that Brzezinski's good just because he's not a neocon, right? So this is the kind of thinking what we see, and I think it's incumbent upon people who have a clear head on this and can see the bigger picture and can analyze this properly to speak out against this Putin worship, because it is pervasive. I mean, it is everywhere you go. I mean, these people show up on my if I do an interview and I criticize Putin anyway, I'll have like 50 trolls come on and say, you work for NATO, you work for the CIA, right? It's just a circus show almost.
And it's interesting the point we mentioned, Trotsky. Of course, Trotsky's escape to the West, and the Trotskyites in the West, they became the neoconservatives, who were largely behind at least the latter stages of the Cold War. They took over the Republican Party, the conservative Republican Party, in the 70s and 80s. And right. Many of these people were committed Trotskyites, and it wasn't based on any committed idea towards individual liberty or rule of law or free market. Is they sort of infiltrated themselves into the power structures of the West, the political party.
Right.
And I guess after Vietnam, they had to go to the Republican Party because the Democratic Party became, I guess, somewhat more isolationist in the aftermath of the Vietnam War. And yes,
that's precisely what took place. So they employed the entryist technique, which was a Trotsky technique, where they embed themselves in a competing political group or ideology and try to steer them covertly into their own camp. So they'll call themselves something that they're not, right? So the neocons call themselves conservatives, but they're not conservative, and all of their policies are very radical, which cannot be considered to be conservative. So that was what those people did, but it just shows the disconnect with some of these Putin worshippers, where they adopt this like pendulum swinging way too far in the other direction. So they'll say like, or some people even do that in the opposite way. So there'll be like people who say, oh well, during the Cold War, the United States was demonizing all these Soviet politicians, perhaps even Stalin to a certain extent. Does that mean Stalin is good? The guy who killed 30 million people? Like, this is the kind of false dichotomy that we're presented with oftentimes in these political debates. It's the new Cold War. It's the Cold War 2.0. It's splitting the entire world into East and West. You choose a side. And my only point was that I don't want to be part of either side. I want to take my own side, or the side of the common people, against these criminal elites of both the East and the West. But one point on Trotsky, I think that might give us an entryway to another topic, is those guys, Trotsky and his followers morphed into neoconservatism, as you said, hijacked the Republican Party, very much took over the U.S. foreign policy under Reagan, and then under Bush, most firstly under George W. Bush, concocted the whole war on terror, created 9/11 as the new Pearl Harbor to kick off this century of war against the Islamic world, which we're seeing dovetailing into this phony civil war in Syria, which they've covertly sponsored through funding, arming, and training the various militant groups, rebels, and mercenaries that they first used to oust Gaddafi and then redirected them and the weapons into Syria and have been fueling that ever since. And a ton of documentation has come out detailing that Western powers, Israel and their NATO stooges in the region, especially in the Gulf region, have sponsored this thing that calls itself Islamic State. It is a creation of these Western powers of Israel as per the Oded plan of fracturing all of Israel's enemies in the Middle East. So all of this is sort of metastasizing right now. What we're seeing is a final phase of this where, Wesley Clark came out with the 7 countries in 5 years. He said that the neocon plan after 9/11 was to take down Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, Sudan, Iran, and Lebanon, I believe. Now, almost all of those countries have been destroyed. Sudan was broken into 2, right? If you remember, in 2006, through a U.S.-Israeli-sponsored separatist movement. The Christians in the south were backed by the West, and they destroyed that country. Afghanistan and Iraq were gutted after 9/11. Now Syria is being destroyed through a civil war. Libya has been completely dismantled and dismembered through a Western-backed inspired insurgency there to remove Gaddafi from power. So basically, all you have left is Iran and Lebanon, which are both being pegged as the next targets of this whole ISIS thing. So they've been quite successful in that whole policy, right? And it works into the neocons. They're Zionists first and foremost, and I've done a lot of work on that issue, but it comes out of that Leon Trotsky Marxist school, as you said, which also gave birth to cultural Marxism, right, which has enveloped much of the West today. So what I've been trying to emphasize lately on my site is, I've focused a lot on the Middle East and Western foreign policy and the Zionist neocon agenda and the Oded Yinon plan for breaking down and fracturing all these Middle Eastern countries, which they're continuing to do. But now what they're also doing is they're mobilizing the consequences of their imperial wars, namely the refugees that they've created by destabilizing and bombing the hell out of these countries. And now they're using the refugees as further cannon fodder for what I call the second agenda of these Zionist, neocon, Trotskyist, cultural Marxists, and that's to, of course, destroy the West as well, to weaken, undermine Western countries.
This is demographic warfare.
Right. It is, and it's completely orchestrated. This isn't something that just happened, that just magically, created itself. This is a clear, very, very orchestrated and defined strategy of breaking down societies, creating internecine warfare through the movement of populations, mass movement of populations, especially into Europe now, dovetailing with the migrant crisis. The migrant crisis is what I call the pinnacle of a long-standing strategy of covert and even overt ethnic or cultural warfare against Western countries. So there's a lot of focus put on the Middle East, and I've covered a lot of the Middle East stuff over the past few years. There tends to be an ignorance, though, on the part of many who sort of fancy themselves as anti-Zionists or anti-imperialists, which I also consider myself to be. But there seems to be an ignorance on that end towards some of the nefarious goings on with regards to what the West and the strategies that have been employed to break down these societies in a similar way that they're doing to the Middle East, but more so under the surface, more so in terms of propaganda, right? It's not a physical war. There's not bombs falling on Berlin anymore, but the war in this case is a cultural one. It's done through media propaganda and academic campaigns, which have been usurped to a large extent by this cultural Marxist phenomenon, right? This ideology of cultural Marxism was, birthed through the cultural Marxist brain trust known as the Frankfurt School, right? Which was these radical Marxists that existed in Germany. They were intellectuals, and they functioned in some universities in Germany until Hitler kicked them out in the 30s. They ended up burrowing their way into the universities in the United States, gaining control.
Like Columbia and things like that.
Yeah, many of the big universities became sort of the meeting centers and the policy centers for these cultural Marxist intellectuals. And the fact is that they are effectively just another offshoot of the Trotsky neoconservative
This is Adorno, Wilhelm Reich.
Right.
Think of it, the other one.
Yeah, those guys.
Yeah, and Wilhelm Reich was more like the sexual revolution stuff. He understood that if you undermine the community's sexual mores and values, you could change the political constitution. It would fall into your lap. And
right.
Yeah.
So they spawned all of that sexual revolution stuff from the 60s, right? The whole hippie drug culture. They pushed that stuff. Mm-hmm. They are promoting dysgenic policies, right? Things like feminism, things like mass immigration, things like the LGBT craze.
But didn't they also align themselves kind of like with the foundations and the Rockefellers? Just kind of like a WASP Jewish alliance working here.
I think in some ways there was the sort of WASP elites that cast away any kind of ethnic or cultural identities, right? These were capitalists first and foremost. People like the Rockefellers and other. They're not committed to any kind of culture or history or ethnicity or anything like that. They are just capitalist opportunists who allied with these predominantly Jewish Zionist elites and bankers and financiers, people like George Soros, the Rothschilds, the Warburgs, the Schiffs, and so forth. These people were the money men behind a lot of these foundations.
And Schiff was the one that bankrolled Trotsky.
Absolutely. He bankrolled Trotsky, sent him to Europe, sent him to Russia to foil communist takeover of Russia, and then he got kicked out, and then they sprung all of these other movements in North America. So they were bankrolling this stuff, and their main goal, so to a large extent, we should point out that the majority of these cultural Marxists from the Frankfurt School are Jewish Zionists who have this ideology of hatred towards Western Christendom, you could say, or just Western culture to a certain extent, largely rooted about persecution of Jews. They believe Jews were persecuted in Europe. Oftentimes that's exaggerated, but they believe that stuff, right? They believe their own lies and they believe their own propaganda, and they fall victim to their own propaganda. So these kind of paranoid lunatic intellectuals that populate this Frankfurt School and the culture Marxists, they're hell-bent on just tearing down the fabric of Western culture, Western societies, Western civilization by promoting dysgenic policies, mass immigration, LGBT, all these unnatural things, feminism, all these things are designed to destroy the family unit, to destroy traditional relationships, to destroy traditional gender roles. So now we're seeing this phenomenon of the transgender and all these weird cultural phenomena that never existed before this time. This stuff is brand new, right off the shelf. Like, we'd never heard of this stuff. And in some cases, they're mobilizing towards normalizing pedophilia. I mean, there's groups out there promoting pedophilia and the rights of pedophiles. I mean, this is the kind of sickening degeneracy that we see being...
And what they do with the media is they sexualize children through the media. And when children manifest that sexualization because they've imbibed this media, say, look, children are sexual, so therefore it's okay.
Yeah. So they've orchestrated it from both ends. Yeah. They've orchestrated the sexualization of children and this disgusting propaganda where they have like 8-year-olds prancing around like strip club dancers in music videos, and then on the other end are using their own propaganda to to normalize and in some cases even try to legalize pedophilia.
Oh, I
So,
mean, Jeffrey Epstein, the scandal
right.
we've had down here, of course, it's not being reported on because it involves some household names, political names in this country, like Bill Clinton and Larry Summers
And Dershowitz.
and Alan Dershowitz. I think Erhard.
People are sick.
Uh,
These
yeah,
elites,
but
these
one of his friends is the owner of I forget what store, girls' clothing store, but they do clothing for kids, and the clothes for kids have become for girls has become overly sexualized.
right.
It's hard to find a decent bathing suit anymore for a girl, for a young girl. And so again, a lot of the stuff I mean, really, it's like full spectrum dominance. It's the media, it's entertainment, it's fashion, and it's hard to believe it is at one level it isn't coordinated. You know, so.
Sorry, you're cutting out a bit there.
Oh, I'm
Can
sorry.
you hear me okay?
Yeah,
Can
I
you
can
hear
hear
me
you.
okay?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay.
Can you hear me
Yeah,
okay?
I can hear you now that the signal was dropping out
Oh,
there a little bit.
I was just saying that fashion about Jeffrey Epstein, a friend of Jeffrey Epstein. I forget what store he owns, but I was listening to an interview.
Right.
But it caters to young women, and also they have one for kids. Talbots.
Hmm.
They have Talbots for girls and Talbots for kids, and how the clothes for the kids have become. I mean, for like pre
Right.
has become sexualized.
Yeah,
And
so
you know,
it's a cultural phenomenon that's being deliberately promoted by the media establishment, by Hollywood, by the music industry to create the desired effect, and then they use their own propaganda to legitimize all these other nefarious things that they are also supporting and promoting behind the scenes, right? So all of this kind of today with mass immigration, migrant crisis, this circus show of feminism and pro pedophilia and this LGBT craze, these transgender fanatics and lobbies that are popping up. This is a deliberate campaign to destroy and tear out the roots of Western civilization, Western culture, to destroy ethnicities, and all this is designed towards removing the barriers that prevent globalism from fully realizing itself, right? So globalism wants to create a global slave plantation, open borders, no borders, and things like spirituality, things like tradition, culture, race, ethnicity, these things stand in the way of a global government. These things stand in the way of the mass movements of populations because people who are deeply rooted in ethnicity or culture or tradition or other concepts, they won't put up with this. They won't support this. They won't of these Zionist globalists who want to create this kind of world where we're all just acculturated plebs. None of us have any roots, identities, attachments. We're just ripe fodder for the globalist slave plantation, the globalist shopping mall, where all we care about is material possessions and consumer issues and popular culture and entertainment. That is the world that they have physically created here in North America, which is the worst of the worst in terms of
mm-hmm.
These globalist havens that they've established. America and Canada, where I live, these places are decrepit, decaying societies where there's no culture, there's no real history. They succeeded in pushing these concepts, these cultural Marxist spawned concepts here. They've really won the day here. And a part of the problem, I think, part of the reason that they're so successful in North America as opposed to Europe, for example, is because these two countries, Canada and America, are fairly new countries, right? They don't have a big history, a long history. The culture was very divided to begin with because even the original founding peoples of these countries had their own cultures. However, those cultures kind of withered away with the movement of many different cultures within Europe moving into North America. So you had different kinds of Europeans move in, and that was kind of multiculturalism in itself, and then that expanded out. They just sort of built upon that idea to incorporate the entire planet, and now they're like moving like half of Pakistan and Africa into the West, right? So they've been able to exploit those ideas and those circumstances to produce what we have today. And Canada, just for so many reasons, is just it doesn't have the potential for a unified country, and it didn't really have the roots for it during the foundation of the country. So they've been able to just turn these countries into shopping malls, gigantic shopping malls with plebs who spend all their money on entertainment and junk. And that's one of the reasons why I think it's important to focus more on Europe and salvaging the real rooted cultures, peoples, and countries of Europe, because they actually have a lot more to hang on to in many respects, and that's some of the stuff I've been covering lately with the migrant crisis deal more with Europe, because I feel it's easier to explain why we should preserve those cultures and societies as opposed to North America, because I think it's just at this point it's very beaten down and decrepit, these places.
In the United States, of course, we had in the middle 20th century, the creation of suburbia through the construction of the interstate highway system, and also the destruction of urban neighborhoods that were ethnic based. A lot of them were Catholic, and this was a plan to create a dispersal into the suburbs and create sort of a deracinated, bland white middle class that was homogenized and all the same. So, right. In a sense, and that's not really in dispute. If you do that's what happened. It was part of a military contingency planning and also a broad social engineering scheme hatched by the WASP elite and the Jewish elite.
Right.
Because one thing, they were very skeptical of Catholic power that was growing. In fact, it was illustrated in the election of John F. Kennedy in 1960, and that might have factored into his murder 3 years later.
Right.
But he. Or what happened was you create what you're describing are people that are deracinated, they're cut off from their roots, and
right.
once they're cut off from their ethnic roots, their religion, their cults, so to speak, what their people, they can be subjected to the psychological warfare that Hollywood and Madison Avenue has to offer, and that is that's sort of like post-war America right there, wouldn't you say? I mean,
right, and that's part of the cultural Marxist Frankfurt School doctrine, because many of them, almost all of those guys, are very strongly identifying Jewish supremacists, I would say. So they maintain their history and culture, and they're even racialists in Israel, and promote they promote their own, and they want to build up the strongest of their people, but then they promote these policies in the West that is designed to elevate the weakest elements of society to the top, right? These weirdos, these odd people, weak people, that's why they piggyback on all these minority causes and LGBT and the gay rights and Black Lives Matter and so forth. So they're promoting all these kind of dysgenic policies, emboldening the weakest elements of Western societies in order to destroy, deracinate, dethrone the majorities, because these Jewish supremacists are paranoid about majorities, right? So whenever they're the minority, they hate the majority. They're always in fear and loathe the majority and seek to weaken and destroy them. Like, I don't hate Jews, but I criticize their insane policies and their insane paranoia, which they've created themselves by fabricating history to make themselves look like the victims. And it's not even just the West that is a target of this. So in the Middle East, the neocon Zionist agenda is obviously overt warfare, but it's also a cultural Marxist sort of critique of the Islamic world, right? So these neocons and these Ziocons are always bashing and critiquing Islam and Islamic culture, and they're highlighting and myopically emphasizing the faults of Islam and the Islamic cultures, that they're mean to women and they're mean to gays, etc. They're pushing that there too. So they're promoting cultural Marxism within the framework of neoconservatism against the Islamic world, also doing it towards the West, and then they're pitting each group against each other in this phony clash of civilizations, culminating in the migrant crisis by feeding Europe with an endless stream of Middle Eastern, predominantly Muslim migrants, and then they're getting their media to focus only on Islam. They want us to bash only Islam and attack Islam and not talk about the overarching strategies, the string pullers, the overseers who are guiding all of these policies, who conceived these policies, wrote them down at their roundtable groups and think tanks. Okay, the migrants didn't create this migrant crisis themselves. They were uprooted through Western Zionist wars, and now they're being used as fodder to promote the destruction of Western cultures. And in Europe, there's a backlash against this, and a lot of these critics of the mass immigration and the migrant influx, they're being steered by the Zionists, right? So they're being told, don't talk about the European Union, the origins of the European Union. Don't talk about the Kalergi Plan. Don't talk about cultural Marxism. Don't talk about Zionism. Don't talk about Israel. And only bash Islam. In fact, the BNP leader, Nick Griffin, he said that in 2007, a neocon, a group of neocons from the U.S. Tried to bribe him and told him, don't talk about the banking system or Zionism or Israel or Jews or even the Jewish Zionist role in cultural Marxism. Only bash Islam. And that's where you have these phony kosher nationalist groups like the English Defense League and Pegida and all these phony Zionist-controlled fake nationalist groups who are springing up. They're getting all this funding out of nowhere. It's all coming from the same financiers, the same Zionist think tanks, the same neocons who are pushing all this. They are orchestrating this thing from both ends, right? They're pushing both sides against each other so that they can ultimately rise to the top at the end of this. They're getting their wishes in the Middle East with the destruction of all of their enemies, and they're using whites and Westerners and propagandizing the West to hate Islam and hate Muslims so that we want to go over there and fight them and destroy their countries for the benefit of Israeli empire. But at the same time, they're telling us they're telling us to hate them in Europe so that we can create civil war and fighting in Europe, where the string pullers who conceive these policies are just sitting in their penthouses. They're not worried. They're not concerned because we're sitting there fighting each other in the streets and not talking about the real issues. So when we talk about cultural Marxism or the Kalergi Plan, we have to identify what is the strategy here. Who are these people who are promoting this? And overwhelmingly, it just happens to be a fact that overwhelmingly these are Zionists. These are Jewish supremacists who have a messianic vision, who have a extremely paranoid view of the world, who think everyone and anything that's not Jewish is a threat to them that they need to destroy. So I mean, they are really the head of the snake of all of these movements. When I started looking into all these things, I was shocked myself to find how many times one of these subversive movements, you look at who's running it, who's defining its doctrines, who's benefiting first and foremost from its policies, and it just happens to be Zionists most of the time. That's just a fact. And if people are afraid to talk about that or to discuss it openly, then they're just being cowed by political correctness. They're just being duped, and they're just acting scared. And they really have you where they want you if you're not really talking about that.
Well, that's part of the psychological warfare, and part of that is control of the language. And when you get called an anti-Semite or even worse, something like a Nazi, for making some of these points, and that's part of the trick. That's part of the guilt that was put upon the entire West after World War II. It wasn't immediate. It occurred, it took decades. It really didn't pick up until the 70s, after the Six-Day War,
Right.
at least in the United States. And that's when they really started to flex their muscle, at least openly, here in the United States. But the Holocaust meme, a narrative which became dominant in the 70s, and that defined the Second World War. Um, but you make some excellent points here because you do when you talk about the destruction of European civilization, and you look back at the 20th century and the world wars in the past 20th century, and of course we get the comic book history to retail to us about what was the cause of those wars, whether it was a bullet finding Archduke Ferdinand, and all of a sudden the because of the alliances and the timetables on trains, and the war became automatic. But inside those wars, there's all types of intrigues. There's the issue of Zionism in Israel, and the Balfour Declaration, which was secured on the promise that Jewish influence in the United States would get U.S. into the war. Wasn't the only interest that got us into the war. There was the Eastern Seaboard financial elite who had bankrolled much of the Anglo-French war effort, but it definitely wasn't in the interest of the farm boys who went off and died in hundreds of thousands in that war, or the millions that died in Europe. Well, of course, you have the Second World War. Is it your view that at some higher level that those conflicts were instigated to bring about what we're seeing today?
I think they're all part of a broader effort. And if we look at some of the intrigues behind World War I and World War II, I've written somewhat about this in some of my essays, which people can find in my book called Hidden History. And like you mentioned, the Balfour Declaration, most people have no clue what that is. And that's telling in itself that our history books have failed to identify a very prominent factor that was involved in instigating in some ways and proliferating or at least exacerbating those wars to serve the interests of this sectarian minority group that wanted to see themselves with a state at the end of these wars. So, with the First World War, there's a prescient quote from one of the Zionist leaders. His name was Max Nordau. He was one of the leaders at the Zionist Congresses. And in 1903, he actually predicted World War I at the Zionist Congress. He proclaimed there's going to be a world war, and then he said that 6 million Jews would be victims of that war, would fall victim to this war.
Yeah, that number, right?
This Kabbalistic number. So they already had this narrative, written. By the dawn of the 20th century, it was already there. They had it ready. They had it packaged. They just needed the circumstances that were necessary to be able to sell it to the public, to sell the idea that Jews needed their own state, needed their own homeland because they're persecuted. So they made up this narrative about 6 million Jews being persecuted, pushed the hell out of it in the media from the year 1900 forward. You had in the year 1900 on the dot, you had Rabbi Stephen Wise, who was the head of American Zionism. He came out and said there are 6 million living, bleeding, suffering arguments in favor of Zionism. Okay, laying out the entire agenda. 6 million suffering Jews. That will be the excuse, the argument, the casus belli, as it were, for Zionism, for creating a state for Jews. And then they started to push it in World War I. You had clippings of newspapers saying 6 million Jews are starving to death in World War I. All turned out to be exaggerated propaganda. Problem they had, though, with World War I is that there was no government in Europe that singled out Jews for persecution, right? That specifically named them and put them in camps or anything like that. But then they were successful with that with World War II, with Hitler. They were trying to provoke Hitler. They were doing the economic boycott that they started in 1933. Judea declares war on Germany. They did everything they can to exacerbate tensions between Germans and Jews because they wanted to uproot Jews from Europe to get them to go to Palestine. That was one of their big problems. They couldn't convince European Jews who were living comfortably, sort of living high on the hog, living the lap of luxury in Europe. How do you convince them to go to Palestine? You can't, unless you uproot them through force, which Hitler basically did for them by putting them in camps, which they had pretty much consented to and collaborated with on a large scale. You find that there's books out there called The Transfer Agreement, Nazi-Zionist Collaboration, where the Zionists made secret agreements with Hitler to deport German Jews, tens of thousands of Jews, to Palestine to set up Israel. So many in Hitler's own party were critical of Hitler because he was not relenting on this transfer agreement policy. They kept telling him that this would be bad for German policy in the region and German interests in the Middle East, that they're going to alienate the whole Arab world by flooding Jews into Palestine. They don't want this. And Hitler just kept with the policy, perhaps in his short-sightedness, just wanting to get Jews out of Germany or what have you. But he unwittingly, or perhaps wittingly, some argue wittingly, but I would say unwittingly, fell into the trap that the Zionists had set for him in rounding up all these Jews, millions of Jews across Europe, putting them in the camps, and providing the circumstances conducive to the propaganda narrative that they needed, absolutely needed, to be able to justify the ethnic cleansing, colonization of Palestine, and the Holocaust narrative. Without the rounding up in the camps, there is no Holocaust narrative. There's no Holocaust narrative. There's no excuse for what they're doing in Palestine. Even if with the Holocaust narrative, I say there's absolutely no excuse for what they're doing. Even if it's all true, there's no excuse for them to go and destroy another people in another land for something that happened in Europe, right? There's no excuse for what they're doing either way, but they've brainwashed much of the world to sympathize with them, to have feelings of guilt and feelings of that they need to repay them for what happened. So that's how they've convinced much of the world to back their murderous Zionist project. So that is a very essential and fundamental aspect of the Second World War that cannot be divorced from it. But if you read normal history books, there's not one mention of the Balfour Declaration, of the transfer agreement, of the Zionists who were promoting this propaganda, inventing lies about 6 million, and all the stories that came before World War II. None of that is in the history books for obvious reasons, that they write the history. They edit and revise the history to suit their own interests. So we cannot believe anything that's written in there. So those things all, of course, tie in and absolutely lead to what we're seeing today. All of this propaganda that's been promulgated through the media in Hollywood about the Holocaust and the Jewish victimhood narrative of World War II is the fundamental foundation of cultural Marxism, was the driving influence behind a lot of those Jewish intellectuals in the Frankfurt School. They'll even say that and cite that in their books, that, you know, like the authoritarian personality, this guy was trying to critique and deconstruct, you know, Western men and the authoritarian personality that led to people like Hitler coming to power and so forth. So they're a paranoid bunch of schizophrenics who are committed to destroying and tearing down anything that they view as a threat to them at some point. So they have to destroy manliness and masculinity because manly men turn into Hitlers, right? I mean, this is the kind of insanity that drives the culture Marx of the Frankfurt School. So there's a lot of anti-white narrative and propaganda that permeates the mainstream media, that permeates Hollywood, perhaps not to the same extent, I would say, as the anti-Muslim and anti-Arab rhetoric. There's that movie called Real Bad Arabs, where a guy, Jack Shaheen, documented 1,000 movies with Arab and Muslim characters, and 95% of the time they were portrayed in a horrible light, in a negative light, portrayed as terrorists and so forth. And of course, who benefits from that narrative? Well, Israel does, Zionism does, neoconservatism does. It's the same people behind both the anti-Arab stuff and the anti-white stuff, because they view both groups as an impediment to their domination and rule over these countries. They want to rule the world. They have messianic dreams of a global empire where everybody's subjugated, everybody's kneeling at their feet. These doctrines exist in their holy books. Not all Jews believe this. Not all Jews are guilty because of these lunatics who have the power and manipulate them too. They're manipulating their own people.